Supporters of Israel, who are mostly on the right, believe the Israeli government's official story, which is that the Jewish state's bombing campaign and ground invasion of Gaza has a single objective, which is to depose Hamas so that its fighters and government no longer pose a threat to Israel. According to this narrative, Palestinian civilian deaths are unavoidable collateral damage in a densely populated urban environment. Those who aren't siloed into team politics on the conflict, like human rights groups, are convinced that the bombing is indiscriminate, that Israel is bombing willy-nilly because they're emotional, they're reacting with blind rage to Hamas's October 7th attack against Israel. Supporters of Palestine, mostly on the left, people that I hang out with, think that Israel is actively targeting civilians in a gleeful, bloodthirsty campaign of genocide, trying to massacre as many innocent Palestinians as possible. I've got news for all of them. They're all wrong. Israel isn't actually trying to kill people. They're willing to, but they're not trying to. It's trying to kill buildings. Of course, people die when buildings get bombed, but killing people is not the Israelis' goal. They're out to flatten Gaza. Flattening some Gazans is a side effect that you get when you flatten buildings. Now, think about it. Most species don't go extinct because they were hunted to death. They go extinct because their habitat gets destroyed. Similarly, Israel's war aim in Gaza, I believe, is to destroy so many apartment buildings and shops and schools and hospitals and other infrastructure that the territory ultimately becomes uninhabitable. The IDF may already have accomplished that. According to the UN, 45% of housing stock in the Gaza Strip has already been destroyed. 1.5 million out of a total population of 2.3 million are internally displaced, i.e. homeless and living on the streets. Only one out of the 18 hospitals in northern Gaza, until 6 weeks ago, the Gaza Strip's most populous area, is still functioning. 4 weeks into the war, 61% of all employment in Gaza was gone. That was 2 weeks ago. This in a previously impoverished place with sky-high unemployment. Imagine if the protesters calling for a ceasefire got their way, that a permanent ceasefire took place tomorrow. Imagine that the war came to an end, that Israel told the residents of Gaza that they could go home safely now. Go home to what? Half the population has no home to return to. That number increases with each Israeli bomb. Upon returning to their homes, many of them damaged, the other half of Gazans would have no electricity or water or fuel or telephone or internet service, no shops or stores to buy food or clothing or anything else, no income and therefore no money to buy it with, no school to send their kids to, no hospital to treat them when they fall sick or get injured. A New York Times reporter who described himself as stunned and who had lived in Gaza before the latest war described a landscape so disfigured by 42 days of airstrikes and nearly 3 weeks of ground warfare that it was hard at times to understand where we were. At one point he asked IDF soldier he was accompanied by where he was, and he was told that he was 300 meters away from a place that he was very familiar with. He just couldn't believe it. David Ignatius of the Washington Post reports that northern Gaza has been reduced to a skeleton. Standing on Salah al-Din Street in Gaza City a week ago, I saw shattered buildings in every direction. It'll be impossible for anyone to live in such a disaster zone. It's not like Israel or the Saudis or anyone else are going to rush in to clean up the mess. Anti-Zionist leftists think that Israel is planning Nakba 2.0, a forced removal of the Palestinian population from Gaza, in which the IDF would truck or march them out at gunpoint. Hot-headed Israeli politicians have fed into that theory with a lot of racist rhetoric. So has a leaked internal Israeli Interior Department government memorandum that touts, quote, a unique and rare opportunity to evacuate the whole Gaza Strip in coordination with the Egyptian government, end quote. In a replay of 1948, the Israeli government refuses to guarantee the right to return home for Gazans after the conclusion of military operations. All this adds up to an inescapable conclusion. After the Gaza Strip has been ethnically cleansed of its Palestinian population, Israel will annex it. While annexation is certainly the objective, I don't think the Israelis intend to actually murder all the Palestinians or to expel them into the desert by force. Israel is already facing severe international opprobrium. Such a radical move would only turn it into a total pariah state. Even the U.S. would have to sever ties. Israel has something else in mind here. Palestinians will leave Gaza of their own accord. The Gaza Strip is already an unlivable hellscape, filled with piles of rubble covering thousands of dead bodies. Rotting bodies hasten the transmission of a lot of nasty diseases like tuberculosis and cholera. According to Euromed Monitor, contact with dead bodies leaking feces, soiled clothing, and contaminated tools and vehicles spread hepatitis, tuberculosis, and HIV, and they ruin groundwater supplies. Birds, rodents, and insects eat bodies and spread other diseases, including malaria. War keeps killing people years after the peace returns. Rubble is very dangerous. Bombs and unexploded ordnance have to be professionally cleared away. That's a process that takes years, even decades. Shortly after October 7th, the IDF dropped flyers over northern Gaza, ordering the population to evacuate south into what they called a safe zone. Most people in Gaza complied. The IDF now controls the north, and the north is mostly Palestinian free. Now, another round of leaflets is falling on eastern Khan Yunis. Now, Khan Yunis is the biggest city in southern Gaza. The leaflets are ordering people to flee from there, the southeastern Gaza, into the southwestern part of Gaza. So first from north to south, then from east to west. That's in preparation for IDF carpet bombing there as well. Take a look at the map and you can find out what the Israelis are up to. They are herding the Palestinians southwest. What's southwest? The border crossing into Egypt in the town of Rafah. Once the Gazan refugees are massed against the gates of Rafah, Israel will open up the border. Palestinians will stream into and across the Sinai Peninsula in search of villages, towns, and cities where they might have some sort of future not filled with rubble and rotting bodies. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi understands this near future. What's happening now in Gaza, he says, is an attempt to force civilian residents to take refuge and migrate to Egypt, which should not be accepted, Sisi complains. But he can't do anything to prevent it. Such an eventuality would mean that we move the idea of resistance, of combat, from the Gaza Strip to Sinai, and so Sinai would become the base for launching operations against Israel. Sisi warns in a message that implies that he sees the Palestinianization of Sinai as inevitable. If Sisi's prediction comes true, it'll be a huge win for Israel. Most importantly, Israel will annex Gaza. They'll clean up the debris, cart away the rubble, and transform Gaza into luxurious seaside resorts and vacation homes for Israelis. If and when the redisplaced Gazans eventually manage to reconstitute themselves enough to once again launch airstrikes into Israel, rockets from Hamas or whatever new organization will replace Hamas will be farther away from major Israeli population centers. Forcing the population of Gaza to flee by destroying the territorial's infrastructure isn't really genocide, not according to the dictionary. What it actually is a war crime called ethnic cleansing, defined in a UN report on the collapse of Yugoslavia as rendering an area ethnically homogeneous by using force or intimidation to remove persons of given groups from the area, end quote. An indigenous resistance organization embedded into a civilian population like Hamas can't be bombed into oblivion. The U.S. experience against the Taliban demonstrates that indiscriminate military action only increases support for your enemy. The IDF is aware of this. Their U.S. allies keep reminding them of America's failed counterterrorism operations after 9/11. Israel is far too aware of its dependence on U.S. political and financial support to even think about killing all 2.3 million Gazan Palestinians, which, besides, most Israeli citizens would be disgusted and alienated by, and they would not tolerate it, no matter how enraged so many of them are at Hamas over October 7th. No, Ethnic cleansing with the goal of annexing Gaza is the only plausible explanation for the Israeli government's behavior since October 7th. Israel is willing to kill people, but they're really out to kill the buildings. I'm Ted Rall, coming to you from the left.